It's so good to see all of you here. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. And I guess this is the only kind of place where this conversation could possibly take place here on the Upper East Side. Although, I don't know, maybe a couple of synagogues and their incredible whiskey and bourbon and Scotch fascination. It's great to have you guys. Thank you so much for anything that has Bible in it is my cup of tea. Although whiskey would be my dad's and bourbon and Scotch. So let's start the evening. And we were joking around. I was joking around with Noah saying any evening of conversation about drinking that has an open bar at the end. Let's not rush through the conversation. Let's give it its just due. I think that's an important thing. So welcome up. I just wanted to start with you, Noah, because you've written the Whiskey Bible, and you've traced not only the spirits themselves, but what's behind the spirit behind them. It's like the story behind the spirits. Tell us. We were just scratching the surface of this earlier, privately, but now publicly. Why were you drawn to this particular subject? You've written 2 books about whiskey and about bourbon, about this particular spirit. What about this fascinates you as a storyteller and as an author? And what do you think that whiskey reveals about about us?
How many hours do we have here?
Yeah, seriously.
Well, I mean, obviously, I have a lot to say on that topic. The book is more than 600 pages, so I have thoughts. But when I started writing about cocktails and spirits, it was about a little bit over 25 years ago. And at the time, whiskey, I mean, I don't have to tell Max and Gabe, but obviously whiskey had gone through a horrible crash in the 80s, starting in the 70s in America. The high water mark for sales of American whiskey in America is 1970 and Scotch is 1975. And then it's pretty much 25 years straight down, right? So by the time the late 90s came about, classic cocktails were just beginning to get popular again, as crazy as that sounds. Nobody drank old fashions, nobody drank Negronis, nobody drank Manhattans and martinis, right? You could ask for a martini and probably have chocolate sauce and Sambuca and God knows what else in there, right? And whiskey was a similar thing. I mean, part of what drew me, I think, originally to whiskey, I remember reading the Wine Bible, which my book is the sister book to Karen McNeil's incredible landmark book, and remember thinking to myself, oh my God, how did she do this? Like, how did somebody get all of this information into one book? I could never write about wine. There's too much to know about, right? And what was comforting about whiskey at the time was that, you could taste all of the bourbons in one sitting, right? There was no rye, right? You could ask for a Manhattan in Manhattan, and the bartender would say, sure. And they'd reach for a bottle of Canadian Club, which is not straight rye, right? Canadian whiskey, a lot of it includes rye, but what we know and love, America's first spirit, I'm sorry, Max and Kate, obviously, rye whiskey comes before bourbon. In America, we were a nation of rum drinkers, and then after 1776, we become a nation of rye distillers and rye drinkers. George Washington had a distiller at Mount Vernon after he left the White House for several years, and he was the most. I think in the book I call him the country's first celebrity distiller, followed in footsteps by many others. But really, up until a few years ago, you really couldn't get, I think, Rittenhouse Rye, which we have over there, is listed in New York in 2005, 2006. Audrey Saunders from Pegu Club, when she opened Pegu Club, and Dave Wondrich, my partner in crime on the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, which we edited together. And we used to do a podcast called Life Behind Bars, not about prison, but about drinks. He and Audrey, I think, requested Rittenhouse Rye to be listed in New York, and that was really a watershed moment, which brought back cocktails and spirits and whiskey. So I feel like I've told you everything but nothing. I think it's
I'm gleaning. I'll tell you what I'm gleaning from this. Yeah. I'm gleaning that something about this particular spirit is an entree. It's a portal into a much bigger story. It tells a much bigger story about unique spirits. Let's say a unique particular relationship with America or
everything.
With everything.
Yeah. I mean,
everything has a lot in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything I think through the lens of whiskey is more fascinating, right? I was the world's worst chemistry student in high school and college, but like chemistry through the lens of whiskey, fascinating,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Like legal briefs, fascinating. Congressional records,
Yeah.
fascinating. All this stuff, right?
Prohibition or like, just the history, America,
I mean,
the whole thing.
it everything. I mean, alcohol is one of these things, which is part of the reason why I write about it, because I mean, obviously, I like drinking whiskey and cocktails, but it's the story behind what we drink, the people, their stories, the places that shape these products is really satisfies me, and I think a lot of folks, in a way beyond just what's in the glass, right? It helps you
Right.
understand and appreciate it more. And whiskey and alcohol is one of these things that really shapes the modern world, right?
Yeah.
There have been a lot of books, salt or cod or this or that, but whiskey is really one of these driving forces that shapes the world and changes it and has wide reaching ramifications in terms of all types of things, from religion to politics to policy to agricultural, methodology. I mean, I'm a New York City kid. I never thought that I would need to learn about feedlots and raising cattle and farming practices, but to write about whiskey is to write about farming and raising cattle because the leftovers are feed.
So what, as you described in the book, seeing whiskey as a cultural artifact, right? This kind of this thing, as it were, that holds within it so many different other
Yeah.
perspectives, so many different other disciplines, so many other moments, right? And the depth to it, almost like the whiskey has a depth that is just not fully exhausted, which by talking about liquor or about spirits, there's something more profound.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you, right? I would say I wrote the whiskey Bible. So, but I definitely think that there is something more profound, right? It's not just a beverage, right? It's
Right.
not just a product, but it really tells the story of the people who made it and the places that it was made in, right? And it's each bottle and each brand in some ways is a time capsule, right? And it tells a story. It's a great storytelling device. Obviously many wonderful stories have been told over glasses of whiskey and in bars, but the whiskey itself, I think, tells a story, right? And it's almost its own. Each type of whiskey, each brand of whiskey tells its own story, right? And it's almost its own chapter in a much larger story. And to be honest, that story is essentially civilization, right? And people have been making whiskey for centuries. The original distillers were probably alchemists, right? They were looking for some kind of water of life. A lot of terms for alcohol mean water of life. Vodka, right, means little water or water of life. Eau de vie. Whiskey itself, the word comes from the Gaelic Ishkabaha, right, which in itself is a version of the Latin aquavitae. Again, I was the world's worst Latin student, so it's amazing that I know this. But
You clearly like this.
right,
Yeah.
but that again, aquavitae, if that I remembered, again is water of life, right? So all of these things mean water of life. They knew that alcohol had some kind of preservative quality. They didn't. They thought it was truly a water of life. It's not. Spoiler alert. But
Yeah.
but it does have many amazing qualities to it. But so I mean, it's all these far-reaching consequences, that involve Winston Churchill, and we talked about Washington and celebrities and prohibition, and and to be honest, I mean, why we're here tonight, like I think a lot of what gets written out, I call it in the book that most people sum up the history of American whiskey as what I call the Uncle Jesse philosophy. Uncle Jesse, how many people grew up watching Dukes of Hazzard here? Right? Sure. So this idea that Uncle Jesse, who's the patriarch in that family, who's
Right.
in overalls, no shirt, no shoes, a straw hat, comes out of the woods, carrying a jug of whiskey. And most people in America, if you say to them, like, who created bourbon or rye or American
Uncle
whiskey,
Jesse.
it's Uncle Jesse, right? And that's not actually true, right?
It's yeah. It's what? What'd you say? You'd say it again.
It was actually Elijah Craig, we like to say.
Oh, there you go. So not Uncle Jesse, but it's a good segue. Oh, I'm sorry. You finish your thought.
Oh yeah, I mean, but moonshining comes only about once there's regulation,
Right.
taxation, right? But in reality, like it's the Shapiras, right? It's a lot of Jews who are coming from Germany and Eastern Europe who are the ones who build this industry in America in the 1800s.
So that's a really, again, a perfect segue. You know, not Uncle Jesse, but Max and Katie. So what is, Kate? Tell us a little bit of the story of the Shapira story, and how you decided, or your family decided to open a distillery in 1935. Like, what's, you know, the 1800s, but then 1935. Let's bring it to you guys and the personal dimension of this evening. Yeah.
I thought that we were almost done because you've talked about George Washington and the European influence of how the industry got started. You've talked about a number of things, and I had a few notes here. I'm going to tear them up. Everything I have, and so
It's
I'm
good.
Done.
Just
I'm done. I'm finished.
Yeah, that's it.
I call. Let's go drink the whiskey now.
Yeah.
Don't encourage them, no.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to start off
You
or
want me to
what?
tell the story? Okay. Well,
Well, here, let me.
you can
let me,
start.
Well, no, let me.
Use the microphone.
See the title of what we're generally talking about here tonight. But just to give you an idea of what the Jewish importance to the development of the industry is, I'm just going to read you a bunch of names.
You came with names.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. You got a list.
And I could have made this list about 3 times, maybe 4 times longer. But amongst distillers, and you're going to get an idea of what I'm talking about. Distillers, last names: Bernheim, Mackler, Grabfelder, Bronfman, Rosenstiel, Sachs, Rosenfield, Schloss, Block, Lux, Blum, Abelson, Getz, and Herbst. Those are all Jewish names, as you can see.
I think
They
we
were
have a
all
minion
distillers,
there, right?
some early
forgot
on,
Shapira.
some midway through.
Yeah.
Wholesalers: Levitch, Lippmann, Marinoff, Allen, Sadoff, Meyer, Glazer, Kahn, Drieben, Davis, Chaplin, Woldenberg, Goldring, and Kasoff. So that's on the wholesale side of the business. So I've reeled off a number of names. Like I said, this list could be 3 times or 4 times as long. But you can see all of these individuals that I read had a piece of how this industry developed, both particularly at the distiller level and particularly at the wholesale level. So you can see just from reading these names, if we didn't say anything else, how
Jews had a
important
hand,
the Jewish people were in making this industry
That's great.
a really viable and big-time industry today.
That deserves a round of applause. Yeah, yay for the Jews.
So that's,
Go on, go Jews. You go Jews.
so now.
Okay,
now,
so
now that's
Max,
you
tell us
asked-
about your particular Jewish family and connection to Kentucky and
well,
the distillery.
Let Kate start this one off.
Okay, that's your turn. Okay.
Before we get to us, there's a lot of interesting stuff about how all these people were
Tell us,
kind of involved. So as I was learning a lot about this, actually, as we were preparing for this conversation, there's sort of before Prohibition and then after Prohibition, the influence of the Jews, right? So, and even before Prohibition, there were sort of 2 segments of the Jewish influence. And all of these are within those many names that my dad was talking about. So you had the people who were actual distillers, like Isaac Wolf Bernheim, who our main distillery in Louisville, Kentucky is named after, and our Bernheim wheat whiskey are named after him. He was one of those legacy long before in the 1800s, a German immigrant who had come and he had worked in hospitality in Europe and then came and worked his way through distribution and then finally said, I want to do this. I want to be a producer. And he started to be a producer. Then, interestingly, there was also, many of you might know that, well, does everyone know what the Bottled and Bond Act was in 1897? Well, the Bottled and Bond Act in 1897, we like to say, was America's first good housekeeping seal. It was the first consumer protection law that went into effect in the United States of America. And why was it put into effect?
Wait a minute.
Yeah, sorry.
Note that 1897 was the Congress of the United States voted that bill into effect. That was before 1905 when the first Food and Drug Act was passed. So for once, Congress got something right. They wanted to protect the whiskey more than they wanted to protect the food.
Food. Yeah.
Well, they were wanting to protect the consumers from the bad whiskey. And this is sort of a little bit of a dark story because apparently so there were what was called rectifiers who were buying cheap whiskey and doctoring it up, so to speak, with this, that, or the other, some of it not so good for you. And there were a number of Jewish families, some of those who were on the list, who were part of the trade, sort of in not combat, but against like the Isaac Wolf Bernheims of the world who were really legit pure distillers, right? So these rectifiers and the distillers were sort of at odds. Many of them both on both sides were Jewish. So the Bottled and Bond Act came to stop all of that and say to be considered bottled and bond, you have to have all these sorts of stipulations and criteria, and the consumer could know that this was legit quality. So this was all the things going on, the Jewish impact before Prohibition, truly on the production side. So interestingly, and this will get into the story of how our family got into this, post-Prohibition, even until this modern day, I have to be honest that the Jewish influence on this industry has been much more so from the commercial side, from the business side, not from the distiller producer perspective.
And I think part of that is the Jewish experience, because why were so many Jews involved in whiskey production in the 1800s? I think it's because it goes back to the laws of kashrut, right? So, obviously, Jews have always had to produce their own wine, right? There are many rabbinical prohibitions the Torah specifies, wine production. But we always produced our own booze in Eastern Europe, Germany, and, also, in the 1700s in places like Poland and Russia, because of anti-Semitism, we were often forced to run, like the King of Poland's, alcohol production facilities, or collect taxes. All these things that were deemed unsavory for a Gentile to do were forced upon us to do. So as a result, we had this skill set as a group of producing alcohol. And, when you think about it, America's formed in 1776, right? And we were producing rum from molasses, from the Caribbean, from molasses, a byproduct of producing sugar. Sugar was the Bitcoin of the 1700s, right? People wanted, pure sugar. Beet sugar is not as good. So that really, like, America's a young nation in the 1800s. We kind of forget that.
Right.
And you have all of these people in Europe, Jews who have this distilling know-how, alcohol production know-how, and just like any other immigrant network, right? You have, and you talked about Bernheim. He comes here. He's a peddler in Pennsylvania. He only becomes a distiller because his horse dies in a very, very cold winter, right? And he goes down to Kentucky. But he had experience in Germany making in a company that handled booze. And then what happens? He writes, there's no calling. He writes to his brother and says, look, in America, like, there are opportunities for us.
Sure.
Like, come here,
They
right?
need boozers.
Right, exactly. So it's the same as
the
like
Jews.
any other immigrant network where you're pulling in all of these people from the old country, and suddenly you have places around America where Jews make up a very small amount of the total population, but we're dominating the liquor production, whether it's Louisville or parts of Ohio or Chicago, Illinois, right, where Jews make up a small amount of the population, but they make up a huge amount of this industry.
Okay, so I'm sorry, so Max is gonna, but I'm really dying to get back to your particular family story, yeah?
Well, let me just fill in a couple of areas, and I think that Noah described it pretty well. The industry really, this is a story that really started a couple of 100 years ago on the Russian steppes, in the shtetls, in the Polish wheat fields, in rye fields, and where, as Noah pointed out, you needed to have wine to be made by Jewish people. That was the first part of that. Those wine people also started distilling from grain, And so they had this history of an expertise of distilling and making whiskey out of grain. There were then two major times when there were huge amounts of emigration of Jewish people to the United States. One was in 1848, when the European continent had an unbelievable political unrest in almost every country, not favorable to the Jewish people in the outcome. That a huge amount of individuals came over in a post-1848 period, and Isaac W. Bernheim came over in 1867. The second piece of that was in about the 1880s and 1890s, and that lasted until World War I started, and then that was the end of that level of immigration until after World War II. My grandfather came over in that latter segment. Isaac W. Bernheim came over in that first segment, towards the end of that first segment. And as you're right, he went down to Paducah, Kentucky. He was an accountant as well as some of the other attributes that he had. He saw very quickly that it was better to be a part of the production side than to be an accountant. Started a distillery in about 1870 in Paducah. Outgrew that, and by 1880 moved his facility to Louisville and started his distillery there at what was now the property that we bought in 1999 and renamed the Bernheim Distillery. So that was sort of the early days. Now, that's where we are now.
And Bernheim goes on.
Yeah,
his big brand is I.W. Harper, which was a bestseller. I mean, it's still available now, but was a huge seller. And it's obviously, the IW comes from his own name. Who was Harper? I mean, obviously, he did not want to call the whiskey Bernheim, because he didn't think probably that people would buy it if it was called Bernheim. So he possibly takes his name maybe from a horse trainer. I mean, I think it's very Gentile, like sort of I.W. Harper is just sort of a general name. And his name does not appear on a label until Heaven Hill puts out the Bernheim whiskey the wheat whiskey that they put out. I think Old Fitzgerald is a similar story that's over there. This founder of Old Fitz was also Jewish, right? And there are a lot of stories. We probably don't agree about some of the history of Old Fitzgerald, but I think he calls it Old Fitzgerald because Fitzgerald is a common Gaelic name that, refers to, people, many, many Americans were called Fitzgerald. So again, it was just a very Gentile generic name, and they knew that like a Jewish name on a label would not sell whiskey at that time.
It's okay. I just want to pick up where your dad's story. Can you do that and just fill in some of the gaps here? Because underneath, already in both Noah's narrative and Max's narrative are a number of themes, like the theme of both the Jewish proficiency, because there was nothing else that we could do, and we had already learned to trade because of what's called yain akum, or that wine that was sold that had been touched or been grown by a non-Jew, disqualified it. But for Jews kind of developed their own internal practices, all of that, cool. But then we get into the places where Jews are smart enough to know that they should be on the business side or in the production side and not on the accounting side, but like the ubiquity of anti-Semitism or that universe of non-Jews or the world where whiskey and spirits are in the domain of the non-Jewish world, and Jews are in, but they can't be out. More Jewish would be too Jewish. Can you just speak into the Shapira family, 1935, all that, and go?
Yeah, sure. Well, just one more thing to that, because jumping between from what Noah's talking about, Bernheim and that whole pre-Prohibition period. Let's talk for a second about what was going on during Prohibition. Obviously, during Prohibition, there were no legal sales of alcohol in the United States. A few distillers who existed before Prohibition were able to continue producing for medicinal purposes.
A lot of sick people.
A lot of sick people.
Very sick.
And in fact,
like marijuana, like a lot of medicinal need for marijuana before it became legal.
Very, very, very sick people.
Very.
But what's fascinating about Prohibition, which I didn't really know, is that a lot of the people who were for the temperance, the temperance movement many, many strange bedfellows. I think it's the only time that the suffragettes and the KKK probably agreed upon anything
Right.
was prohibition. But one of the reasons why some people supported prohibition, like Henry Ford, was because they were anti-Semitic and they were trying to deprive immigrants from a means to make a living. And Jews were so synonymous with whiskey and the alcohol industry that by closing the distilleries, they thought they would drive the immigrants back to Europe, which is crazy.
I want to come back. I want to come back to how far we've come from Jews being so identified with whiskey, because I think that the vast majority of people here, or those who would be watching this or listening, would not know that from this moment culturally. But like, yeah, pick it up.
Okay, so as I was saying, prohibition happens, no longer legal sales of alcohol here. But there was not prohibition in Canada. So there was a very, very, very important Jewish family who was producing out the wazoo in Canada and helping not just fulfill all of the medicinal needs in the United States, but all of the speakeasy business in the United States, and that is the Bronfman family. And
Which is why we're having this tonight under the banner of the Bronfman Jewish
Exactly.
Center.
So the Bronfmans started making Canadian whiskey in Canada, they were very active in the bootlegging pipeline in the United States during Prohibition. So that's just a backdrop of another important Jewish contribution to the alcohol landscape. So fast forward.
And technically, if any of the Bronfmans are watching, they were shipping their booze to a tiny island in Nova Scotia that was part of France and is still owned by the French. So technically, they were not shipping their booze to America.
Good.
They
Good
were
to clarify
shipping it
that.
to France. This rock in the middle of the ocean that had nothing. A car dealership opens up during Prohibition because the cod fishermen are making so much money that they want a car to drive around this tiny island. And then where it went, who knows?
We don't know.
I mean, that was not their business.
That's not my business either. Okay, so Kate, go ahead.
Okay, or do you want to talk about during Prohibition, what our family was doing?
Sure. Yeah.
You want me to do it?
I'll do it.
Okay, go.
So, how did we, as a family, get into this business? It goes back, first of all, when my grandfather immigrated to the United States in the late 1880s, early 1890s. He settled in Kentucky, moved to a very rural part of the state.
What brought him to Kentucky, by the way?
He had a friend.
Friend.
Just like
Hey,
lots of
come to
people.
Kentucky.
Come to Kentucky, we'll find something for you to do.
Got it.
He started life as a peddler. Incidentally, the story that I'm about to tell is really sort of that great American story to the core. What happened to us and what we did is really, we think it's unique. We love being a part of that, but it's really not that unique a story. The same thing that was going on with our family was going on with thousands and thousands and thousands of other families, both Jewish and non-Jewish, at the very same time. Immigrating to the United States, settling in some part of the country that you wouldn't think they were going to be settling in, and starting a business. And you can think of all sorts of people who did that. But going back to our family, my grandfather started out as a peddler, a pack on his back, selling household notions and thread and thimble and things like that. That business got a little bit better, and he got a horse and a carriage, a little bit more inventory to expand the business. And ultimately, that business got a little bit better, and he opened a junior department store in a little town called New Haven, Kentucky, which is still there, and there's about 500 people who live there today, and probably about the same amount back in those days. But he sold literally everything from pickles in a barrel to small farm implements and just about everything in between. He got married, had 5 sons, and as those sons became of age...
We're pictured up there. That's them, aren't they?
Yep.
Yeah.
As those 5 sons became of age, in about 1920 to 1925, generally in that range, he sent them out to open similar kinds of stores in towns that were contiguous to where New Haven was. these other towns actually happened to be the centers of the economic development in each of these towns. In each of these counties, they were the county seat towns where most of the commerce took place. My dad was sent to Bardstown. Now, interestingly, as Kate was describing, you had Prohibition, 1919 to 1933, and starting in 1929, you had the Great Fall on Wall Street and the beginning of the Great Depression, which lasted basically until World War II started. So you had these two historical facts. Along about 1928 or so, everyone could see that Prohibition wasn't going to work. You had both the importation of illegal alcohol, on which no taxes were being collected. You had people making moonshine that was very bad whiskey. People were dying from methanol poisoning. Again, no collection of taxes. You had unscrupulous people breaking all sorts of laws. You had the beginning of what you might call the mafia. And it just wasn't working. It was a great social expression.
And we
great
pay
social
income tax
experiment was
because of that.
pretty much on its legs, dead. 1933 comes and it's over. Bardstown had been a hotbed, a center of the American bourbon whiskey industry pre-Prohibition. So as everybody could see, Prohibition ending, there was many groups who wanted to get back in business again in a legitimate, appropriate way. My dad was very well known in Bardstown. He had been there for some years and operated a successful business, knew a lot of people knew him, and a group formed that wanted to start up a new facility. They had all the technical expertise. They knew how to build a distillery, make some fine whiskey, age it properly, and all the other elements that go into it. But they needed some capital. So they came to my dad and said, would you like to make an investment in this really new enterprise? It wasn't even an enterprise. It was just a figment of somebody's imagination, frankly. But they made an investment. This doesn't sound like a lot of money today. Back in those days, this was a lot of money, $18,000. And that was a lot of money in those days. And I often asked my dad, I said, why did you get involved in this? You know, they were very conservative people, very conservative business people. And this just seemed to be sort of on the edge of the envelope of what they would normally do. He said, we were all young. It was a new industry starting basically from scratch. And we thought it would be just fun to be a part of it. After about 18 months or so, the distillery had gotten built. The business was starting to manufacture whiskey. But the individuals who had all the technical expertise ran into some personal financial difficulties and came to my dad and said, we're going to either have to liquidate this, sell it, or raise some additional money because we've got some personal problems having nothing to do with the business, and we've got to get them solved. So ultimately, they came to a decision, and our family, with another real gulp of faith, because I will tell you, they were strictly financial investors. This was private equity, 1935 style.
You guys were not in the, you weren't not in the business of you were not in the alcohol and the whiskey, nothing.
We jokingly referred to it that they didn't know a barrel from a box. They didn't know anything about how to make the whiskey. They were just strictly investors, allowing the other individuals to bring the technical expertise to bear on and to make this a success. So it was a real leap of faith and total together now, there was about $35,000 invested in this facility. My dad, because he was living in Bardstown, was told, let's see if this can work or not. You're in charge. See what you can do. My dad was a really hard worker and very smart along the way. And he hired some great people, including a member of the Beam family from Jim Beam Company, and worked very hard to learn the business and but waited and waited and waited to bring out a product to be able to put some effort and energy behind telling the story about that product for 4 years till 1939. Brought out a brand called Old Heaven Hill Bottled and Bond, made under those very exacting standards that Kate was referring to before from the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. As Kate was saying, when you had a bottled and bond whiskey, the public began to know that this was like that good housekeeping seal of approval. That brand, Old Heaven Hill Bottled and Bond, quickly became the #1 selling whiskey in the state of Kentucky, and the family said, well, this could actually develop into a real business one of these days. So those are really what I call the early days of how all of this got started.
Well, that's a lot. That's great. How did Heaven Hill? Where, Kate, you want to tell that part? I want to.
Yeah, this is a great story.
Yeah, and nobody interrupt Kate, please. Everybody, I want Kate to finish. I want Kate to finish a sentence tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So the land on which Heaven Hill sits in Bardstown, how many people have visited us in Bardstown? Yeah, so you know. So the land on which Heaven Hill sits was owned by a farmer named William Heaven Hill, who owned the property. And the company's name was originally going to be called, it wasn't originally, it was intended to be called Heaven Hill, all one word, Distillery. And when the family member, I guess my grandfather, went to the county clerk in 34 at the time with his little registration thing, the woman screwed up and she made it 2 words, Heaven Hill Distillery. And it was the middle of the Depression, as we know, and they didn't want to pay the extra money to have it fixed. So the name of the company became Heaven
There you go.
Hill.
Okay, that's esoteric.
So it is not a place, it is a person. And we actually have a product that we only sell at our visitor center in honor of William Heaven Hill.
And so how big? For those who don't know, how big is Heaven Hill? How big is the whole Ganze thing? And that's a Yiddish term for everything. What's the whole enchilada?
It's big.
There are how many? There are what, 70 warehouses now? How many?
70 warehouses on lots of different properties. So our main property
throughout
in
the country
Bardstown-
and the world.
Well, no. Bourbon is bourbon.
No,
except
I don't
for
mean.
Widow Jane's
I don't mean
aged
the
in
warehouses,
Kentucky.
but I'm saying, but you sell. I mean, it's
All over the
carried
world.
everywhere.
Yes.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. All over,
Like,
all
where
over
can
the
I go
world.
and get it? Like the most crazy place. I'm in.
And Jake,
Right
you've
down the
traveled
street?
the world.
No,
Where's
down the
the
street or
craziest
going
place
over here?
you've seen any
You know,
of our
getting
brands?
whiskey in New
You've
York
been
City
everywhere.
is not crazy. But where would I I'll find a bottle on a shelf.
China?
In China or
Yeah,
in Russia and
China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You won't find any in Russia.
And in Russia.
Yeah, no, not in Russia.
Not in Russia.
We have a salesperson who'd like to be selling them.
Okay. And of all the
What,
biggest
Alice, where you stop?
distilleries.
Random Island, were you in? Mystique. Mystique. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
A couple little extra things to add into the story that I have recently I realized, because our 90th anniversary is next week. So we've been doing a lot of these historical reviews of the company, a lot of interviews, a lot of uncovering the old history. Actually, also the reason we had this is because we just recently moved our corporate headquarters in Louisville. Beautiful new building, and we were going through some old papers and files and whatnot, and we found all this cool stuff that had been hoarded in my dad's office, and we went through it, and it was amazing. So a couple of interesting things. In addition to the venture capital in the middle of the Depression, my dad forgot to mention that, he did say it, but they invested in this. They had nothing to sell. So they were doing this, and they weren't even getting to monetize it for a long time, right? Really bizarre. Not only, they were young. Really young. My grandfather was not even 30. He was like 25 years old. He was the middle of the brothers. And my grandfather, you actually tell it a little wrong, because my great-grandfather actually died in 1921. So the hero of this whole shebang of a story is my great-grandmother, Annie Shapira, who raised these 5 sons. There was actually 2 others who died in infancy. Raised these 5 sons pretty much on her own. The oldest was 20 in 1921, but the youngest was 7. 5 boys.
Wow.
And she ran the stores through that time period between 1921 and then I guess until the oldest one, and or until she sent your grandfather out to the stores. She was the boss of the girl boss of this family, right? So let's be clear. That's a part of this story that isn't often told. That is a really, really cool nuance for sure.
And one of the other details that I didn't know until Max and I were talking a few years ago about the Louisville stores, they were family stores. I said to Max, well, when did you guys sell them? When did they close? Like the 40s, the 50s? And you said, what, the 1970s, right? And he was like,
A little bit later than
the
that.
90s.
right, 90s?
90s.
Yeah, right, because I remember you looked at me and you said, well, we didn't know if this whiskey thing was going to work out, man. Like,
Right.
obviously we were going to keep the stores going,
Right.
which blew my mind. I assumed that, like, you had
That was the fallback.
right that
Wow.
was gone. But I mean, the family was running the Louisville stores.
Yeah.
There were what, at the most 5 of them, I guess.
Oh, no,
Or
many more.
Many
than that.
more than
12, 13.
There were at one time 15 of them.
15.
So, no, I don't know if you know this. I was telling someone earlier, but how many people have been to the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience in downtown Louisville? So that visitor center is actually on the site of the headquarters of the retail business of the Louisville stores. And I even have memories of a kid. Each floor was like the warehouse. There was the shoe floor and there was the jeans floor. And we used to ride up and down the freight elevator, causing havoc in there. And that's now the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Well, can you pivot now, everybody, just for a second? Because I also want to. I'm sure there might be some questions out here. I want to kind of make sure that some of the people in the audience who might have a question we haven't covered. We covered a lot of ground, but I'd like to, if we could for a moment, the whole Jewish Kentucky. I mean, it's one thing Jews are in the industry, in the whiskey, in the bourbon, and so on, but Jews in the South and Jews in particular in Kentucky, was it hard? I mean, talk a little bit about what it was like growing up Jewishly. How important was your Jewish, identity? How important was it in the business eventually when you get into the whiskey business? You said there were obviously many other Jewish families. How central was Judaism and Jewish identity to your experience growing up?
From a personal view.
Both personally and then also professionally
Well,
in terms of the industry.
Make sure you tell the nun story.
There you go. There's the nun
Well,
story. It's coming.
I had a really unique growing up experience. I lived in a town, Bardstown, Kentucky, 4,000 people, very small town, very much rural, mostly a farming community, and we were one of 2 Jewish families in this entire town. Again, this is rural America. I'm growing up in the 1940s, 1950s. I lived there until I was a junior in high school, and then we moved to Louisville.
What about first grade?
I'm getting that.
Priceless. Okay.
Now you might find it. What was that like? We kept a kosher home. We went to Sunday school in Louisville on Sundays. We drove to Louisville and back. I was bar mitzvahed along the way, and did all the learnings of that by not remote, by going to Louisville, working with the rabbi and the cantor at our congregation in Louisville. And all during this period, I never, ever, ever recall anything that one would remotely say was anti-Semitic. Now, I will say my dad was involved, and my mother, who was from Chicago, when they got married, my dad told her, he said, Sylvia, we're going to be in Bardstown until we get the business up and running, and then we're going to move to Louisville. Well, my mother loved being in Bardstown. She was Jewish, of course, and became involved in every community activity that you could imagine, the Flower Club, the PTA, things that went on beyond the PTA in school, and just about any and every kind of social activity that you could imagine. My dad, of course, was involved in business related throughout the community. I went to a school. Now, this is the comment that Kate wanted me to make. This is sort of an interesting story. we had a certain age by which you had to turn, a certain date by which you had to turn a certain age in order to go to public school, to kindergarten and first grade. And I missed the cutoff date by, I don't know, a week or 2 or 3, but my parents thought that I was ready for school and didn't want to hold me back. Well, the public school just literally wouldn't relent and wouldn't break the rule and regulation. So my dad went down. I forgot to mention this. Bardstown and the surrounding area is one of the most heavily Catholic areas of the United States. Was then and is today. In fact, the first cathedral built west of the Allegheny Mountains was built in Bardstown. Over the course of the years, all that was moved to Louisville, but the first cathedral west of the Allegheny Mountains was built in Bardstown. But anyway, I had to go to school, so the only other school system was the parochial school system. My dad went to the Monsignor, who he knew, and said, Max is ready to come to school. Would you mind if he came to the Bethlehem Academy for his kindergarten, for his first grade? And they said he'd be welcome. So my dad asked the further question. He said, now, we would love for him, we'll be glad to send him there, but when you're doing the religious part of this, is it possible that you could take him out of the class and give him some other work to do? Now, I think you're going to think that I'm nuts when I say this. I remember it vividly to this day. They took me out, and I would go into another room, and the sisters would give me extra math lessons. And I'm thinking, wow, they're in there doing something else, and I have to do all of this math. I remember this so well. But the funny part about this is that we were in Louisville one Sunday after
Because
Sunday
the
school
grandparents did not
to tell
know
my
this.
grandmother, and we had not told my grandmother, my parents and my grandmother, where I was going to school, thinking there would be a real, oh my goodness, kind of a moment. And my grandmother was asking me the question, how do you like your teacher? And I said, oh, well, her name was Sister Ripperod. I said, Sister Ripperod, she's really nice.
Wow.
And
Uh-oh.
the cat wasn't out of the bag because she didn't hear all that well.
Uh-oh.
My dad or mother, and I've forgotten which one, said, oh, he's talking about his sister.
His sister.
That's a true story. So, but growing up in Bardstown was uniquely different. I loved it and value the total immersion that I had, my parents had, that we as a Jewish family had in that community, and it worked just great.
I'm sorry.
We the three of us. Kate doesn't remember this, but we did a talk in Louisville in the basement of the Evan Williams Experience. I think in 2015, right after The Art of American Whiskey came out, and at the time, Ann, who was Max's aunt, who was 101, joined us. Right, it was 3 generations of Shapira family. And I remember saying, Kate doesn't remember this, but I do. I said to Ann, I said, what was it like being Jewish in rural Kentucky? And do you remember what she said, Max?
I don't remember.
She said it involved eating a lot of ice cream. And I said, what do you mean? She said, because we would go every Sunday to the church after services, to the ice cream socials every week. And she said to her husband, one of the brothers up there, and said, why do we have to do this? And he said, well, these are our customers. This is our community. Like, we have to show up at these ice cream socials because that's our community. That's part of the life in Kentucky, in this town. So that was how she remembered being, and otherwise
eating a lot of ice cream.
Yeah. And let me just tell one other story. When I was in school, in the regular part of the public school system in Bardstown, on the holidays like Passover, I would bring matzah to school. No bread, no whatever.
Yeah.
And the teachers would ask me to give a little talk about
the
what
matzah?
this all was.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember all these things, well received, those kinds of
Sure, the wafer goes
and
over well in
I
Catholic.
felt nothing. I felt nothing of it, you know. And but I will have to say, some of virtually all of my friends were non-Jewish. They marveled at the fact, though. I don't know whether I should say this in front of the rabbi or not.
I'm not listening. I'm not listening.
Don't listen to this. I guess my parents felt a little bad that, you know, we didn't celebrate Christmas in a sense of celebrating Christmas, but they felt that they didn't want me to be left out totally. So in some way, shape, or form, Santa Claus would come down our chimney and leave one or two presents. But my friends all knew that we got presents at Hanukkah as well. And I said, how do you get two Christmas? Just another story of growing up in a rural town,
right,
and how you become accepted and part of a community.
Well, that story of assimilation or accommodation or even more creative integration is a story also of the whiskey industry to some extent. I mean, these things are moving obviously in parallel structures. Jews in Louisville, Jews in Kentucky, Jews in the South, decidedly not centers for Jewish activity. You know, my father grew up here in Forest Hills and in Brooklyn. You know, speaking Yiddish. He was born in Berlin, but they spoke Yiddish in the home. It's a different experience than growing up in Kentucky, and also moving from department stores or these general stores into this industry. You keep your foot in one to make sure. You never know if you're really going to succeed. Jews aren't really sure yet. I just want to broaden this before we open it up here. It's like I have a big, maybe the wrong question because we're about to start drinking. So I don't know if it's the right question, but this is a precarious moment for Jews. It feels in some ways. We here in New York are talking a lot about it, and there are some writers one academic wrote about the end of the Jewish. The golden period of American Judaism was an article written by Frank Foer last year. People arguing whether it is the end of it or not, but certainly the sense that you can start a successful industry in the whiskey, in spirits, right, in the South is a story of success, of Jewish integration, of Jewish assimilation in the best way possible. But looking forward now, I'm just wondering about the American project as we go forward. Questions about that's a big question, but is your sense when I ask you, do you feel equal parts American, equal part Jew? If someone says to you, who are you? Are you American? Are you a Jew? Where does that land for you, Kate? I just want as this generation.
Well, this topic could go on for a long time.
Right.
Really,
I know.
my
It's
husband here for this. I know this.
Let's go have a
this
drink.
This is a terrible way to end this part, but I think that I don't know if it's probably the same. Well, it's probably not the same. It's a different experience than those of you, obviously, who live here in New York, where, there's been a lot of things because there are so many Jews here in New York. And and I'm not meaning this to be judgmental at all, but, you hear things that because you've always had so many Jews around you, you could find yourself being a bit complacent in your comfort of being Jewish. And living in a place where there's so few Jews, we from a leadership perspective, the Jewish people in Louisville who are smart and dedicated and interested get asked to lead everything. So the responsibility on those of us who are leaders in business and leaders in philanthropy have that much more responsibility. We have to. There's no choice. It's not a choice of whether you want to be engaged in the Jewish community or not, because it's part of our responsibility to give back. That is, I think, is different when you live in a place where there's so few Jewish people. And I think that the responsibility is that much more heightened in the past couple of years in a really concerning sort of way. And I've been very involved for a really long time, and it's a pretty disturbing dynamic for sure. I mean, like it is all around the world, but just when there's so few people in our situation who can philanthropically make a real difference in our community, it's just that much more pressure.
Noah, you were going to say something. Thank you, Kate. That was really
I mean,
strong.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, it was sort of a non sequitur before, is that for those who've not been to Bardstown, it looks like a Hallmark holiday movie, Bardstown. I mean, it's incredible, right? It's like,
Today on the snow.
oh, I'm sure it's snowing. I'm always expecting, a young person to come back into Bardstown and meet the local Christmas tree grower who's recently been divorced and has a child. I mean, it's literally a Hallmark holiday movie. Like you stand in the middle and you're like, I can't believe that this is real.
It's a real
like,
place.
And then you're like, what's that smell? It's like, oh, that's bourbon in the air. Like, I mean, it's like it's hard to describe how incredible. And Heaven Hill is literally just down the road from Bardstown, the middle. So, I mean, it is very different. I mean, the main hospital in Louisville wasn't it up until recently. It was called Jewish. I imagine it was Jews who started the hospital in Louisville. There are still, I would say, a strong leadership of the Jews who are in Louisville, and it's not a huge community, but a significant one. And in Lexington too. I mean, I've done a talk. There's several professors in the religious department who are very active in bringing people down like myself to talk about the history of Jews in the liquor industry. And so, I mean, which again, I'm a New Yorker. I've lived here my whole life. My family's lived here. I had no idea what Kentucky would be like, to be honest, before I started going seemingly every 6 weeks or so. But it was incredibly different than I could have ever expected, and in many ways much more welcoming than I could have ever have thought, to be honest.
I want to give some.
We left the part about the industry in 1939, and when I said those were the early years for our company. So it's now 20 minutes to 9. If you all don't mind, we can wrap this up by about midnight when we go through from 1939 to 2025. No, but seriously, I read off those names. And some of those were historical names and names that have been lost to history and all of that. They're obviously not so many of them are alive or whatever. But the industry today is still very much involved with companies run and or owned and or run, or a combination of both, by Jewish people. Particularly true, we have a 3-tier system. We as producers can't sell directly to you as a consumer. We sell to a distributor or a wholesaler as a middleman. That middleman then sells to what we call the retail accounts that you normally would see, or on-premise, bars, restaurants, clubs, whatever. So it's 3 tiers. The middle tier of wholesalers today is really hugely dominated by Jewish people. The largest company in the industry is a company called Southern Glazer Wine and Spirits. And it was a combination of a firm, Southern Liquor Company and Glazer Distributing Company, both family-owned Jewish families. And that is probably about 60% of the overall business. The second largest company in the industry is a company called RNDC, Republic National, again, owned by several families, all of whom, with the exception of one, are Jewish, run by Jewish people as well. And that is probably about another 20% or so of the wholesale side of the business. So you can see how important Jewish people, Jewish ownership within the industry is to making sure products get from us to the consumer in an efficient and effective way. And it's a very large, involved piece of the whole chain of command in our industry. But even at the supplier level, like ourselves, there's a couple of companies. There's ourselves, and there is another company called Sazerac, owned by a Jewish family out of New Orleans. And again, making up a really significant and important part of the overall supplier side of the business as well. So making a very long story short, without going through all the history of our company, you can see today Jewish people are hugely involved in how this industry operates today.
Let's take a couple of questions or comments here, and if we can run a microphone over. Do we have an extra microphone?
He has a very loud voice.
Okay. Right, but for but people want, for the recording, it won't.
Absolutely. So it strikes me you all are speaking about being American Jewish business leaders. Can you talk about how you think about making decisions? It strikes me the story about naming it Bernheim Wheat Whiskey took a little bit of courage, even in when you launched that product, to call it after a Jewish name. How do you think about making decisions as both being American Jewish business leaders?
Well, there's always one in every crowd who asks a tough question, and I know the person who asked this question here. I don't think that we ever thought of that when we named it Bernheim. We were more thinking of the history and heritage of Mr. Bernheim as being an early distiller who helped put the industry on the map and had been involved in our industry for a long period of time. We were wanting to honor his tradition, his heritage, and the history that he brought along. It didn't matter whether it was Bernheim or Smith or whatever, we would have probably done the same thing.
Okay.
And Bernheim himself, like when he passed away, left his own holdings, his estate, which is now the Bernheim Forest, which is a much beloved.
Yeah, it's about a 15,000 acre nature preserve just south of Louisville. It's quite an extraordinary asset to the entire region of the country.
Yeah.
Nice.
It was interesting to hear your story about how you finance some of it. Did you ever have any issues with the banks in getting funds?
No, we run the banks also. I mean,
All right, so
don't we? Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, in the early days, there were a couple of banks, one in Bardstown and one in Louisville, that gave some financing, had enough faith and confidence in who we are and what we did. Remember, that's now 90 years ago. And guess what? We still do business with both of them.
That's great.
Wait, did we ever have any trouble with any banks that wouldn't lend to Jewish people?
My dad never said that they ever had any trouble. I will say we found some in the archives somewhere in cleaning out something. We found some very early, like in 1939, financial statements, and it was a monthly statement. And just sort of had to laugh at looking at it on the income statement. It was things like sales expense, $8.42, and things like that. But at the bottom line, there was a small profit of $3,000, and that was pretty good in 1939 for a business that just started, or 1940. That was a business that just started.
And I think that was fairly unusual, though. Like Jewish or Gentile distiller entrepreneurs had a very, very hard time getting money from banks because A, it was still the Depression, B, nobody knew if Prohibition would come back, right? And Prohibition gave such an unsavory undertone to the whole liquor industry that the banks really did not want to be involved with distillers. So, I mean, that's basically why folks like the Beams or others turned to folks like the Shapiras who had money to invest in these ventures because there was no money from banks. And obviously banks, a lot of FDIC, the banks were a mess and they were not in any way, shape, or form willing to lend most of the whiskey companies money.
Okay, folks, we have time for one more. You've been so patient knowing that there's an open bar. I just love it. This is a great audience. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the future of the company and the bourbon industry. I saw that Heaven Hill has made investments in tequila and some other spirits. I think we all know or have read about the decline in drinking within Gen Z and younger generations. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the future.
Sure. Well, this is a surprise. We've been talking for the past hour and a half about bourbon, and certainly bourbon is the heart and soul of Heaven Hill, but it's actually only 30% of our business. And people find that hard to believe. We are a super diversified company, which has actually been part of our success and able to endure for 90 years, because we haven't talked about it here. We've been doing a lot of interviews because it's our 90th anniversary, and this question of the future comes up a lot. And one of the ways that we have truly been able to endure is because consumer tastes ebb and flow a bit. And sometimes vodka is really popular. Right now, agave is really popular. We happen to have two of the fastest growing tequila brands, both our Tequila Ocho brand. Hopefully, many of you have had an opportunity to try that. And our brand Luna Azul Tequila are amazing, amazing tequilas. We own a brand called Deep Eddy Vodka. And then many, many, many other brands. Liqueurs, pomegranate liqueur works great in many a sisterhood or other women's federation.
Bar mitzvah, bat
92nd
mitzvah,
Street
bris.
Y
Yeah,
event.
nice, yeah.
The significance of the pomegranate works very well.
Nice.
Yep.
Fertility,
So
got
we're
it.
a really diversified company. And, the consumers are bizarre people, right? We have such a diverse United States of America, and I don't mean politically, but truly diverse types of people and types of interests and types of tastes. And right now in the industry, our premium whiskeys and our premium tequilas are as hot as ever. When we are releasing a special release, our 90th anniversary release, lines out the door, right? Camping out, waiting to buy this. And then the other one of the hottest, most growing things is this horrible brand called Buzz Balls, which are this super un-eco-friendly, high sugar, high proof, awful color, and it's one of the fastest growing things. And so there's everything in between. So
Like the TikTok of liquors, or
like
whatever
the
it is, or
TikTok
like
of liquor. So,
okay.
there's so many different trends, so many different headwinds.
Which is owned by a different Jewish family, but okay, yeah.
Yeah. And then if you and we were my dad did a couple interviews this morning, and we've been saying this line, like the headlines are much louder than the facts, and so plenty of people are still drinking. And, when you talk about like the bourbon industry right now, is it down 2%, 5%? We're not talking 30 or 40%, like Bitcoin goes up and down 30 to 40%, every year or whatever. So it's always been generally stable. So don't succumb to the clickbait of the headlines. We're not going anywhere. We like to say we're just getting started.
Nice.
We just made a $200 million investment in a new distillery back at our roots in Bardstown. And it's really exciting. We'd love to host you all in Kentucky.
Oh, that's a nice invitation. I just want one last question from me as the host. I'm a big fan of a Kentuckian, profoundly gifted musician, Chris Stapleton. What's the deal with Tennessee whiskey? That's what I want to understand. Is it smooth?
Tennessee whiskey?
Yeah. Is it smoother than Kentucky whiskey?
So generally, if you want to start a fight in a bar, you ask people.
That's okay.
Is
That's
Tennessee whiskey is it bourbon, right? And
okay.
I can definitively. My friend Nicole Austin, who's a distiller who runs George Dickel. George Dickel was not Jewish, but he came from Germany too, and ran a liquor store in Nashville. And Nicole is a very brave person, because I think she's the only person who's ever squashed a discussion, if we want to call it that, on Reddit, right? This thread of whether Tennessee whiskey is bourbon. It 100% can be labeled as bourbon, if it wants to be, right? But Tennessee, in particular, up until fairly recently, it was just Jack Daniels and George Dickel. Both of them use what's called the Lincoln County process, which is basically they do charcoal filtration before it goes into the barrel. Why? Well, they don't even know. But in the whiskey, but I know, right?
Okay.
So in the whiskey
Tell
Bible,
us.
basically, we'll condense it down to 30 seconds, but essentially what allowed Americans to make a whiskey unique and distinct from what was being made in Ireland and Scotland was called a log still. It was literally a log. and we used the newfangled technology of steam to heat the still, right? Because we like to cook the grain in the still because it makes better animal feed. Again, what do I know? I'm a New Yorker, right? Animals can process very rich food, so we like to cook the grain in the still, which then basically is better for cattle. So that's why we use the log still, which turned into the chamber still. It was so famous that for a long time in Kentucky, the bourbon wasn't called bourbon. It was called log and copper because the first distillation was in a log still. The second distillation was in a copper pot still. Basically, it was very unpredictable. So that's where the charcoal filtration comes in handy. Both Jack Daniels and Dickel both used a chamber still. Now everybody in Kentucky, essentially, and Tennessee uses a giant column still. They do not have to do the Lincoln County process. If they didn't want to, it would taste different, but they don't have to do it. But basically,
Wow,
it's
this
an
is quite a
affectation.
question.
It was a great question.
Okay. So, wow.
That was a short answer.
That's the short answer. And if you want the longer answer, and if you want anything, just want to, before we break and thank everybody, just to let everybody know that Whiskey Bible is available for sale in the corner over there. Obviously, as we've said, in this corner, there's the Bible, and in this corner is the whiskey and the bourbon and the drinks. It's all in this corner. What an incredibly rich conversation! I thought, thank you to Max, thank you to Kate, thank you to Noah. Really, it's really like what started off with Max letting us know that he had nothing to say after we had opened became much, much more profound, just like the liquor and like the substance itself. We thank you all for being here at the 92nd Street Y this evening for this incredible conversation. Thanks to our AV team, to the entire Bronfman, there's that name, Bronfman team here for putting this together, particularly to Jacob Nurick and to Sharon and to Carly. And to everyone here, please, we have many more programs on Jewish life, not many more programs about this fascinating topic, but at our Friday evening Onegs once a month, we do have an open bar as well. So we invite you to come back for that. Thanks again for being with us tonight, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.